Today, we are going to expand on the last video where we talked about simplifying radicals, and today we're going to simplify radicals that also include variables. In the last video, we just looked at radicals that were numbers, so no variables, but today they're going to include variables. It's just going to add one little extra wrinkle to it, but it's basically going to be the same thing. So we're just going to jump into our first example. So square root of x to the 8th. Square root of x to the 8th. So when you have a variable inside the radical, it really comes down to the exponent. The exponent will decide and will help you decide what the answer is. So because this is a square root, in actuality, there is an imaginary 2. Okay, we don't put the 2, it's just understood that it's there. It's kind of like when we write a fraction or when we write a number like 4. If we were to make this a fraction, it's actually 4 over 1, right? It's the same thing. We know it's there, but we don't really put it. If I give you x, well, what number's in front of x? We know that's actually 1x. All the same concept. A lot of things in math are like that. It's assumed it's there, it's known it's there, we just don't put it. So in a square root, like this one, there's actually a 2 on the outside. There's a 2 on the outside. So to simplify this down, all you're going to do, it's really simple, is you're going to take this exponent and divide it by 2. And that is going to be your answer. So in this case, your exponent is 8. 8 divided by 2 obviously is 4. So our answer is x to the 4th. We answered the question, what is the square root of x to the 8th? What is the square root of x to the 8th? The answer is x to the 4th. Square root of x to the 4th over square root of y to the 10th. So if we were to look at it, remember there's an imaginary 2 here. You don't need to actually put that there, but there's an imaginary 2. So all we're going to do is divide by 2. 4 divided by 2 is x to the 2nd, divided by 2. 10 divided by 2 is 5, so y to the 5th. So all we're going to do is divide it by 2. 8 divided by 2 is 4, x to the 4th. 4 divided by 2 is 2, x to the 2nd, or x squared. 10 divided by 2 is 5, y to the 5th. Okay, now hopefully you have a question in your mind as we go through this. What happens if it's not even? What happens if the exponent is odd? Because we're dividing by 2. And if it's odd, obviously it will come out as a decimal. So let's look at that. Square root of x to the 7th. Square root of x to the 7th. So here's what we're going to do. When your exponent is odd, we're going to break this radical up into 2 separate radicals, like we did in the last lesson. And we're going to simplify each part of that down separately. Okay? So how are we going to break it up? All you're going to do is this. X to the 7th, we're going to break it up as x to the 6th and x to the 1st. So we're going to take these 7 and we're going to put 6 of them in one radical and 1 in the other one. It is always going to be like that. When you have an odd number exponent, you're going to break it up where one radical is just going to have 1 in it and the other one is going to have 1 less than that. So if this is x to the 10th, it's x to the 9 and x to the 1. If this is x to the 5th, it's 4 and 1. If this is x to the 99th, it's 98 and 1. So it's always going to be 1, and it's always going to be 1 less than that number. So we're breaking it up. Of this, there's 7 x's here. We're putting 6 of them here, and we're putting 1 there. Okay? Now, what is the square root of x to the 6th? We just talked about that, right? All you do is you divide it by 2. Divided by 2, divided by 2. So divide that by 2, that becomes x to the 3rd. Now what is square root of x to the 1st? If we divide it by 2, 1 divided by 2, that comes out as a decimal, and we don't want that. So we're going to leave this as just square root of x. That is your answer. Okay, so once again, let's walk through this. Because that's an odd number, we're going to break it up into 1, always 1, and then 1 less than that. So of these 7 x's, we're putting 6 here, we're putting 1 there. Then we simplify each of these separately. We're breaking it up and we're doing each one separately. Square root of x to the 6th becomes x to the 3rd on the outside of the radical. Because we answered this question, what is the square root of x to the 6th? We answered it. The answer is x to the 3rd. It goes on the outside of the radical. Square root of x to the 1st, we cannot answer it. We don't know what it is. And we can't divide it, so we leave it as square root x. Okay? Square root of x to the 9th and square root y to the 4th. Square root x to the 9th, square root y to the 4th. So let's break it up. 9 is an odd number, so we're going to break it up into x to the 8th and x to the 1st. Okay? Now y is an even number, so we don't have to break it up. We're just going to leave it as y to the 4th. Okay? So x to the 9th became x8 and x1. y4, because it's even, we're just going to leave it. We don't need to break it up. Even numbers you leave alone. You don't need to break those up. Odd numbers we need to break up. So now let's look at each part of this. What is the square root of x to the 8th? X to the 4th. What is the square root of x to the 1st? We don't know, so we're going to leave it in the radical. And now what is the square root of y to the 4th? Y to the 2nd. And that needs to go on the outside of the radical. So if you can answer the question, it goes on the outside of the radical. If you cannot answer the question, it stays inside the radical. Square root of x to the 8th is x to the 4th. That goes on the outside. Square root of x to the 1st, we cannot answer it, so it stays inside. And square root of y to the 4th, we can answer that. That becomes y to the 2nd on the outside. Sometimes people have trouble figuring out, does it go outside or does it go inside? If you can answer the question, it goes outside. If you cannot answer it, it goes inside. We can answer that question, x to the 4th on the outside. We can answer that question, y to the 2nd on the outside. We cannot answer this one, so it stays inside. And we always want to put the ones that we answer in front, not in back, because if we put it in the back, it may look like it should be included in the radical. So make sure we always put it in front. So now we're going to combine this lesson today, which is variables, with the previous lesson, which is the number part. Okay? And we're just going to combine those together, but to do it, we're going to separate those out and do them one at a time, because then it will be much easier for us. So first, let's look at 24. Is 24 a perfect square? No. So let's break it up. In the last lesson, we were talking about, think of two numbers that can multiply together to equal 24. One of those has to be a perfect square. So if you think about all of those, I get 24. 12 and 2, neither are a perfect square. 8 and 3, neither are a perfect square. 6 and 4, 4 is a perfect square. So we're going to break up 24 into 4 and 6. 4 is a perfect square, so we can use it. Now we have x to the 5th. Now we're going to worry about the variable. X to the 5th, 5 is obviously odd, so we're going to break it up into x to the 4 and x to the 1st. Okay? 24 got broke up into 4 and 6. X to the 5th got broke up into 4 and 1. So now we just look at all four of these parts separate of each other and do them one at a time. So what is the square root of 4? 2. What is the square root of 6? We don't know. So we leave it. This is what I was talking about on the last example. Can I answer this question? Yes. So that answer goes on the outside of the radical. Can I answer this question? No. So it stays inside the radical. What is the square root of x to the 4th? X to the 2nd. It's on the outside because I can answer it. What is the square root of x to the 1st? We can't answer that. We don't know, so it stays on the inside. When do I know it's my answer? When do I know it's in what we call simplest form? Is when you can't break this up. I cannot break this up at all. There's no number that multiplies to get 6 that is a perfect square, and the x does not have an exponent. If you have a variable that has an exponent and it's inside the radical, it is not in simplest form. Okay, that's a good rule to go by. If you ever have a radical and inside of the radical you have a variable where there is an exponent, you can keep going. Okay, you can keep going. So you always want the variables inside the radicals to not have an exponent. The next one says square root of 20, x to the 8th, y to the 9th. So once again, we're going to break this up piece by piece. So 20 is not a perfect square. We can break up 20 into 4 and 5. So square root of 4 and square root of 5, because 4 is a perfect square. So now x. Well, x is to the 8th, and 8 is even. So remember, if it's even, just leave it where it's at. You don't need to break it up. Y is to the 9th, that is odd. So we're going to break it up into y8 and y1. Okay? 20 got broke up into 4 and 5 because 4 is a perfect square. X to the 8th stayed x to the 8th because it's an even exponent. Y to the 9th is 8 and 1 because 9 is odd. So now we look at each one separately. Square root of 4 is 2. Square root of 5 we cannot answer, so we leave it as square root 5. I can answer this, it goes there. I cannot answer that, it stays inside the radical. Square root of x to the 8th becomes x to the 4th. Square root of y to the 8th becomes y to the 4th. Remember, you just divide those by 2. 8 divided by 2 is 4. 8 divided by 2 is 4. Square root of y to the 1st, I cannot answer it. It has to stay inside. Has to stay inside. Last example. Square root of 16x y to the 3rd. Well, first let's look at 16. What can I break up 16? Well, 4 and 4. 4 is a perfect square. 8 and 2. The thing is, 16 is a perfect square. If it's a perfect square, don't break it up. Just leave it as square root 16. It's just like if you have an exponent that's even, you don't need to break it up. You just leave it like it is. Same thing here. 16 is a perfect square. I don't need to break it up. I don't need to split it up. Just leave it and write it down. X is to the 1st. Now, this is actually to the 1st, okay? But it's odd. So we talked about when it's odd, you have to split it up. But since it's to the 1st, I can't really split it up. So we're just going to leave it as x to the 1st. Now, y to the 3rd is odd, so I need to break it up into y to the 2nd and y to the 1st. Okay, 16 is a perfect square, so it just stayed there. X to the 1st stays x to the 1st. I can't break that up. Y to the 3rd becomes y to the 2nd and y to the 1st. And now, once again, we're going to work out each of these separately. What is the square root of 16? 4. What is the square root of x? I don't know what that is. I can't answer it, so it has to stay inside. What is the square root of y to the 2nd? Remember, there's an imaginary 2 out here, so we divide. 2 divided by 2 is 1. So that goes on the outside, y to the 1st. And the square root of y to the 1st, I cannot answer it, so it stays inside. So once again, break it all up. We broke up the 16. We broke up the x. We broke up the y's. Break it all up, and then look at each part separately. If I can answer it, like the square root of 16, it goes on the outside. If I can answer it, it goes on the outside. If I cannot answer it, it goes inside. If I cannot answer it, it goes inside. Break it up, do each part separately. It should be pretty good.